Because if it were easy, it already so, yeah. Go ahead. You can go down. Well, so I appreciate it.
They were fine. They didn't really have time. So if I can take them to the table, so we'll be right there. And I'm right there. But I think there was a I mean, the me too.
And yet, corporate in you
because we need help to develop World Bank. Having struggle because it wasn't into it. Trying to get the answer.
or what I found is one thing to do is screen and say what you can do. I think it's going to happen pretty well. One of the design processes makes some
And that's where their response.
Well, that's what CRD is designed we're not going to prescribe a solution, but let the stakeholders say, you know, this, you didn't have, you know, this and this, we don't enforce it. We don't enforce it because we have to. So you can sort of see where the easiest challenge to execute is. It may not be to do it, so I think CRD could be a big
our big challenge solutions every month. It's going to come up and say, okay, this time I want to work with but I didn't think of that in advance for my tool.
Right.
So you got to have a robust problem.
Yeah, right. Because headquarters is all the solutions. It's got to be a framework and a process.
Okay.
Okay. Sure.
If you could leave your name badges on the table.
There's somebody. No. Take these off?
Then come right over here.
No name badges?
No, I think table 10.
Oh.
Where do you want us?
If you could stand kind of around here, hopefully we won't have that red thing. Ruben, you feel free. That's where he's like, here we go.
It's kind of dark, but
You want to move the banner?
I was going to use the sign, but we just moved it against
bottom head.
Is that so responsible, John?
Just what you know.
Thanks, John.
So John, you can stand on this side, and we'll stand on this side.
Yeah.
Oh, there you go.
No, I need a wide release like this. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Ruben.
Good job.
Thank you all.
Oh, your coffee before we run out of time.
The only thing that Jamie just confirmed, she said from a webinar perspective, she said it really looked really good. Yeah. Looked really good. The webinar,
Really?
she said the webinar.
Everything's recorded these days.
Yeah.
Let me know. We'll work that out.
that's my personal. That's the first one that we did.
I wanted to play you guys.
Deborah, very good to meet you. Yeah, totally. Yeah, I used to know the boss, like, what goes next. Yeah, competitive drink for one. So, I mean, that's. Yeah, that's fine. Do you know where things go? Like,
Yeah, for sure.
yeah. No, I mean, should we just leave it? Okay. I mean, it's John or Roger. Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yes, I think you're.
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, I think people probably just choose their own. Just these three? Yeah, I think so. Okay. There you go. We should, if we could get bottles. Yeah.
No, it's the right thing.
too. Already behind. Yeah. Well, I just think that the breaks are not long enough. Like it's too tightly packed and the breaks are long. We'll see how it goes. John is paying attention. Okay. Before, after you. You're right on here. How did you? I think it's hard to hear at the podium. You're looking back. It's hard. I think for the panelists, it'll be good, and that's actually crucial. Like more like we have in session. I have my boyfriend. That's where it's at.
This guy and then him.
Oh yeah, that's actually good too. Yeah. You can still tell. Yeah.
And
That's
then
actually
John like moving it away.
I
I mean, he actually pushed it away. I'm like,
Yeah, we'll make sure you get anything else that's different. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, you guys are perfect. You ended right on time. Yeah. No, you guys were perfect. Yeah. And it's more of a thing where we have these panels where you have like 30 speakers and 10 minutes. That's where it's like.
the thing is, we only have like 20 something, and then I went into the module and sent another.
How are things going to
I just sent a reminder. And we got like 10 more.
Okay.
So I'll do the same thing. Saturday.
Yeah. I just thought I said it this morning. Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah.
That makes me happy.
Yeah, I know.
I haven't registered, and I've asked them to
They
go
sent it to you.
register.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So yeah. Fortunately, they were able to just send me the what they were planning to send me. I have a meeting. Yeah. I thought the name, but like I was sure you tomorrow.
I don't know.
I was like, I don't even recognize this.
I don't.
I know, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
I know. Like that turnover. Okay, you can go for it. Roger. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So this session is just John. So we'll do an intro and then John will speak. So is this a good place for me to sit for you? Okay, great.
Are we going to Trump?
Yeah. So the schedule is intro. John will speak from 10:50 to 11:10. I mean, we're a little behind. And then until 11:45 actually. Yep. Yeah.
Yeah, welcome. Really glad you guys are coming. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's really looking forward to you guys and we'll continue to.
So you're gonna talk from up here, or?
Yeah, I'd prefer to start after.
Yeah.
John, so you've got until 11:10.
Okay.
Do you want me to? So there's also the clock up there, but.
Okay, we don't have to sit up here.
That I don't.
Good. You want me to sit and then get up, or stand over there? I'll just stand out of the way.
Yeah.
There's a lot of Johns. Yeah. I like that, John. John with the climate office. Nice to meet you. Yeah, no, it's just forward to.
So Jonathan's over here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are there still many people outside? Yeah, could we encourage them to come in? We can get started. Are we set? Yeah? Okay, good. Thank you. We'll ask you to hurry to your seats so we can get started. So thank you for joining us again. And in this session now, before we go to lunch, John Furlow is going to spend some time introducing us to the project overall, to the framework and its annexes. As you've seen, the annexes are out on the table just outside the room. So I hope you've had an opportunity to glance at them and take a copy. John is going to walk us through them a little bit. So that we have a sense of what's there, and then we'll have some time for a question and answer before we break for lunch. So, John?
Okay. Thank you. It's me again. Thanks for coming back. Before I get started, I wanted to say to Roger Mark's question about all of the teams working together, this has been a blast for me. Our team at USAID has been great. It's Jenny and Jonathan. Andre may have stepped out. We used to have Nora with us for, I think, 4 years. She was great. She's now working with Cascadia, but can't work on this project. So that's been great. And then we've had Joel and Jason and others from Stratus. We've had Peter and Charlotte and Joanne and a big team from ICF. Wonderful support from Glenn and his team at IRG Agility. That may be the first time I've said Agility. It's just been a lot of fun, and particularly the Agility crew have pulled all of this together, and so far it seems to be going quite well. We've got Columbia University, the IRI, the International Research Institute for Climate and Society, and Arizona. Jim is over there. We've got Lawrence from NCAR and others from NCAR working with us. The Mountain Institute, and University of Texas, who is not represented here. So it's been a lot of fun. And South Carolina, Ed, who was in our office for a year as a AAAS fellow and then went back to South Carolina and is continuing to work with us. So it's been a thrill for me to work with everybody, and a real honor as well. So I want to walk you through what this CRD framework is. When I came to AID in 2006, there was virtually no adaptation budget. There were earmarks for clean energy and biodiversity, which covered sequestration. But you could do adaptation, but it wasn't targeted. So we had a small budget. We, with Joel and Glenn and others, put together this initial guidance document on how to address climate vulnerability in development projects. We focused on individual projects. We didn't have the scope to think about whole economies or whole programs. We focused on specific vulnerabilities, exposure, sensitivity, adaptive capacity. And this was it. We screened for sensitivity. We tried to keep it simple. If it didn't seem like your project was going to be climate sensitive, you could stop. These were the steps. I think this is still useful if you have a specific project that you know you're going to do and you want to understand how vulnerable it may be. I think this still works. But in 2009, 2010, the budget started going up. There was a call for an adaptation program across the agency. And we had an opportunity to take a broader view to see how things began affecting each other and how non-climate stresses could play in and undermine the robustness of a project. I really started thinking about this in 2008. We were doing a project with Conservation International and WWF in Madagascar. And around the time that we got there, the Madagascar Action Plan was coming out. There were a bunch of things in it that Madagascar hoped to achieve. And they were each addressed in different chapters. And some of those things you can see here on the slide. They wanted to increase road coverage. They wanted to they wanted to triple the amount of protected areas. They wanted to bring in at least 50,000 more visits. They wanted to increase rice production, both the extensiveness as well as the intensiveness of rice production. And then other things that are in there, we're looking at livestock production, looking at non-rice, non-staple vegetable production. And at this workshop that we did, and when I was reading the map, the Madagascar Action Plan, I started thinking, where are they going to do all this stuff? Because it's hard to see on this map, but Madagascar is about 80% deforested, or it was back then. There was this little spine up the middle of the island that still had trees. And everybody was looking at that. That's where they were going to do all their stuff. These concentric circles, what you really need to take away from that is the coloring is not great here, but the red ones are places that have been identified as high potential for protected areas in the future. So new national parks. The green ones are places that would be good for rice production in the future. The purple ones, let's see, do we have a laser? Oh yeah, purple ones would be good for cash crops. And the brown ones would be good for livestock. And as you can see, they overlap with each other. And in a lot of places, you know, you wouldn't go to a national park to look at rice paddies, or you wouldn't go to a national park to look at livestock production. And yet that's what's going on, because that's what was left as robust, viable places. And what became apparent to me was they developed the map individually without talking across and without thinking about the consequences of if you double roads, you can't grow rice on a road. You want to put a road either from, you want to connect things with roads. So there was this problem with what they were doing. So we started thinking about, well, the ideal way to do development and climate would be to think, where do you want to be in 50 years? Let's really think about development. So you want to move from a lot of climate sensitive economic activities with vulnerable economic growth and poor governance to a more diversified economy. You want to be robust and resilient to climate-related disasters. Your mitigation angle would come in with new technologies, changed market conditions, finance, and then on the adaptation side, you'd have more effective governance, you'd have better use of information, you'd have more robust planning and design. And then, when we started talking to countries, we found that thinking out that far just was hard. That's multiple elections. It's the cost of thinking about that is too much. So we began thinking about working within whatever planning they've got, a given country has going. This is the basic framework. Peter mentioned the steps. The first is scope. An important part of that is thinking about the development context where you're working and building climate into that, treating climate as a stressor, not as a sector, but as a stress that cuts across the things that you care about. Assess the impacts. Once you've identified that climate is a major stress in agriculture, but maybe less so in judicial reform, focus on agriculture. And then assess to understand exactly the nature of those vulnerabilities, design your programs and your interventions, implement them, and evaluate and manage them. These last three are consistent with most program cycles, but the first two, I think, are where we began changing the way we looked at things. This is it in a nutshell. First, identify your development objectives. Then, and this is all done with stakeholders. This isn't us defining someone's development objectives. This is letting the host country or the community do this for us, and we just ask questions and facilitate their thinking on these issues. What does it take to improve agriculture, to increase tourist visits? And you can think back to the things on the map, the Madagascar Action Plan as examples. Talk about the inputs. Agriculture needs land, labor, and capital in sort of classical economic terms. It also needs functioning markets, access to finance, et cetera. What things or what stresses undermine those inputs? What are the climate stresses, but also what are the non-climate stresses, so that you can think about the whole system and how it works together, rather than focusing too closely on one problem. If you solve the climate problem, but you haven't solved the problem of never enforcing regulations, you may not actually achieve the outcome you want. And then you can break down your sources of climate vulnerability so you understand where problems are arising, and then start thinking about solutions. This is the example broken down for food security. I kind of walked through that already. And then we had a chance to apply this for Jamaica. We started talking to Jamaica in early 2012, and they had they'd had an election recently. They had a new prime minister who had just said that she wanted to have I think they called it a super ministry of water, land, environment, and climate change. And climate change was in the title. And Jamaica had also just developed their vision document, a national development plan for the next about 25 years, I think, based on when it came out. And these are the national goals. Let me go on to a zoomed in version. The things that we think of as economic sectors were down here in one area, and then climate change was down in a separate one. And immediately when we would talk to the ministries responsible for agriculture or for tourism or infrastructure, we'd ask them how they were dealing with climate change. They'd say, oh, that's down here. Somebody else has to deal with that. And we have a new ministry, so it must be being dealt with. And we'd talk to the ministry about how well they were working with these groups, and they'd say, well, we're having trouble because we don't know them, we're new, blah, blah, blah. So we decided the prime minister actually called for a new national policy to try to tie, I think they had maybe half a dozen or a dozen unfinished policies around in different ministries. She wanted an overarching one, and we had the opportunity to work with them, and it was a lot of fun. So we had a chance to test that framework as a national development policy tool. And we worked in tables. We had a big workshop in Kingston. We brought together, I think we had consistently about 100 people over the course of 2 days from about 20 or 30 different ministries. We mixed them up and had them at working tables. And most of the time was spent at tables of about 8 people, taking apart that development strategy and weaving climate into it, understanding how climate and climate change would undermine the goals that were in their 20-year development plan. This is how we did it with flip charts and stickies. This is what it looked like. Under the kind of internationally competitive industries, agriculture was a big one. Livestock was a big component of agriculture. And then some of the stresses they identified: climate, tropical storms, increases in temperature, changes in the timing and amount of rainfall, non-climate migration, land use change, deforestation, pests. So we walked them through it, and it worked. This is what it looked like when we typed it up. You can see ag, key inputs are energy, water. There's crops, livestock, and fisheries, the card we just looked at. You've got the legal and regulatory framework. You've got access to finance. You can see the stresses arrayed around. Then we ask them, what would you do about these problems? And who's responsible? So some of the things they talked about were water harvesting, flood and heat management for livestock and chickens or poultry. And information kept coming up, the need for better information so people would know what they were coping with. And so that meant that the Ministry of Water, Land, Environment, and Climate Change, and in particular the Met Service, was key to everything. And the Met Service in Jamaica, like in a lot of countries, is not the biggest and best funded department in the government. And I think Glenn Roy can tell you that. So the question was, how do we make the powerful ministries begin to understand that the services that the Met Department can provide are indispensable, not because we should have good information, but because the Ag Ministry, which is powerful, the Energy Ministry, which is powerful, can't deliver on their mission without having this information, because the operating environment that they work in is changing. So we came away, and I'm sorry for all the words, we came away from the workshop with people, they really enjoyed working together. There was one table, the tourism table. A friend of mine walked by and looked at it, and they had all this stuff that they were going to do and the things that were undermining it. But they had nothing about transportation. And our former colleague Mike said, well, where's transportation? How are people going to get to the hotels and the sites? And they said, oh, we've got a great road network, particularly along the coasts. We got that covered. He walked over to the transportation table, and they were planning, they had a brilliant idea. They were going to save money they were going to stop maintaining the coast roads because they got flooded periodically, and they were going to hold the money and then rebuild inland where they wouldn't get affected by storm surge. So Mike went back to the tourism table and said, you know, they're getting rid of your roads right over there. So somebody got up and went over, and the country, I mean, these were the decision makers in the country, the people who became the climate change focal points that Roger Mark talked about and trained last week, decided that they wanted to continue to work in this multi-sectoral way, multidisciplinary, multi-agency way. We got them to agree to a relatively thin, we didn't get them. They came to the conclusion that rather than writing a really dense policy that would be owned and maintained by the Environment Ministry, they needed to distribute responsibility across the government. They accepted, it was not an easy thing to accept, but they accepted that if the Environment Ministry tried to tell the powerful ministries what to do, they would just ignore it. And so they created this idea of a policy framework that would lay out a justification for addressing climate change and but shift responsibility to the other ministries. They now have about 26, they have climate change focal points in about 26 ministries and agencies. Each of those is developing a sector work plan to address climate change as part of the implementation of the sector policies. So it's no longer a single climate policy, it's about a dozen. Yes, about 12 in the first year. Here's some of the transitions that we've seen take place in Jamaica. They've gone from a single policy to 12 sector policies. They've gone from the Environment Ministry being responsible to pretty much everybody being responsible. They also decided to incorporate mitigation at the same time, and they are continuing to operate in this multidisciplinary, multi-agency way. The sector work plans that are underway, aid is supporting forestry and agriculture now. The 5 Cs, the Caribbean, it's Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, thank you. And the EU are supporting fisheries, and then you can see the others. Those will get started soon. This is everybody that's involved. So it went from the Climate Ministry, or actually when we got there, it was the Planning Institute was writing the single plan, to now look at this list of people who are responsible. And I believe that they are actively engaged. Roger Mark can comment on that more. You're gonna hear a little bit more over the next day or two about, or several days, about some of the other applications of the CRD framework. We got started with it in NAP development in Tanzania and in West Africa. That has kind of stalled. I think we got a little ahead of ourselves there, but Joel Smith and Charlotte Mack are going to talk about that after lunch. We applied the methodology basically involving stakeholders and identifying their interests and their risks. At the community level, very large community, a number of communities actually, but the Everest area in Nepal, and Alton Byers is going to talk about that later. We applied it to a single utility in the Philippines, the water utility, and then you'll hear a lot more on Wednesday on Urban Day. So quick overview of the West Africa workshop. I'm going to skip through this because Charlotte and Joel are going to talk about it later. This is the Khumbu, the Everest region. Oh, and the one thing I like, and I'm sure that Alton will talk about it more, but to help people understand climate risks, we developed these little cartoon cards so that they could, I don't think we need Explorer. So people could actually put the risks and the assets that they have in the community around on a map of the community and really start to visualize how things came together. You're going to hear a lot more about the CRIS program on Wednesday. But again, the focus there was on not the infrastructure, as Peter said, not the infrastructure, but the services it provides. We wanted to open up space to think about not protecting the things that you have, but protecting the services that people expect from a city, so that you can think about alternative ways to accomplish the same outcome. I believe that Jason is going to talk about this. Glenn is nodding. But this was an application in the water sector, and one of the interesting things to me with this case it was a place where we really saw that some of the things that were undermining the water sector were not the climate problems, but issues of governance and maintenance and so forth. And again, the non-climate stresses may be the most important. Solving the non-climate problems may be the best way to deliver despite climate change. As Roger Marks said, we have a number of these annexes to the basic framework coming out. Climate change in coastal zones and climate change in water are just out. Congratulations, John. I know that has been stressing him out and making him sweat and lose sleep and everything as we tried to wrap it up for now. The Dacha Bureau and Mary Ackley, I believe I saw earlier, is going to talk about this later on. The Dacha Bureau helped or really led this for us. Oops. And then Ed worked on marginal populations. We have a governance guide that's coming out quite soon. And then some work on evaluating options as well. Thank you very much. And we can take questions.
Great, thank you very much. So before we get to your questions, John, when you started and you sort of laid out the approach and you talked about 5 steps and you had those 2 arrows going up, one of the measurements that you had was resiliency developed. Okay, or resiliency enhanced. So those of us who work on adaptation and who work on climate resiliency talk about how those two relate to each other. And specifically, this project is called Climate Resilient Development. So can you talk a little bit about how you see climate change adaptation fitting in with climate resilient development, recognizing that there's a lot of, there are many reactions to this concept of resiliency. Some people like it and some people don't. Some people find it useful, others don't. So, and you are aware of the debate around that. How do you see this work fitting in to the context of adaptation and climate resilient development? How can you position some of that for us from your perspective?
Sure. I think of adaptation as being a more specific and narrow thing you do in response to, you have a problem, you respond, you adapt to it. We started thinking more broadly about the topic. I don't think we had a good name for it. We were loosely calling it resilience without...
You didn't get the bottle of wine.
I did not. Glenn won that for himself.
Okay.
Sort of like the great Pope search, Cardinal Ratzinger, when he discovered that he was the best potential Pope. There was no black smoke or white smoke when Glenn came up with the name, I don't think. So initially with that the 2007 guidance, we were really focusing on single or a small set of stresses that would undermine an already described project. And then both with the advent of a much broader program at USAID and with recognizing that in a number of the places that we had been working, we'd think we were solving the right problem and then something else would come in and undermine it. And we just weren't taking a broad enough view. And so we started thinking about how can we notice and recognize, development isn't a single cause and effect thing. It's a number of conditions that come together. And so we wanted to be able to see that multitude of conditions and make sure that we were catching the right one that was going to undermine progress. The term resilience, I think we were a little bit unacademic when we first started using it. We were probably sort of thinking that resilience was the opposite of vulnerability, and there's a lot more to it. But I think we got lucky, and the term that we picked in 2009, 2010 has served us well because we are trying to look at a multitude of factors that come in to support development and a multitude of stresses that can undermine it. And I'll just say for the agency resilience policy and the partnership with Rockefeller and all that the other areas where the agency is addressing resilience, the idea was, again, that a multitude of problems undermine development. It got former Administrator Shah's attention when, first with the food security crisis in the Horn of Africa a few years ago, and I think he asked an obvious but fairly simple question of, if we invest so much in agricultural development in Kenya and Ethiopia and elsewhere in the Horn, how can we have this problem? And how come this problem is coming back? It's not a one-off. We see crises in the Horn recurrently, and we're investing in development. The idea is that that investment would resolve the problem. So why isn't that happening? And so when we started looking at it, we realized that we were investing in development in Kenya in the south and in humanitarian relief in the north. And the two communities, it's different budget lines, it's different people working on it. So that led to a concerted effort to get them together around the same table, I think literally, to plan out what to do about this problem. And that's consistent with what we had been doing in Jamaica, with getting the transportation people to talk to the tourism people so they didn't take away the roads. So that's getting a bit long, but that's what we've been thinking about.
Great. Thank you. So I saw a few hands. Yes, we start in the middle, please.
I actually have a question from online, if you'd like to
Yes,
take it.
please.
This is from Kulthum Omari. He's joining us today from University of Cape Town. He's a PhD student. His question is, the presenter said solving the non-climatic stressors could be the best way to address climate change. Would you please elaborate this further and give examples where this approach has worked?
So from Cape Town, non-climatic stresses.
Sure. So thanks for watching. That's great. So what we've been thinking about is we had a workshop. The first place we actually tested this framework was in the Eastern Caribbean. And we designed an entire program in about a 45-second exchange between two people, two of the stakeholders from the region. And somebody said, we build stuff right on the beach, and then we have a storm and it gets knocked down, and we go right back and we build it in the same place. We need zoning codes so that we don't do that anymore. And somebody else said, no, we have zoning codes, we just don't enforce them. We need to learn from Barbados because they enforce them and they have a good system in place. And it went on from that, but the idea was that it wasn't the magnitude of the storm. If you build right on the beach, if you've always been vulnerable to anything that's not even a tropical storm, worrying about climate change is not going to, if you never enforce what you intend to do, addressing a new risk on paper but not in fact is not going to solve the problem. So that's the idea, and you can imagine that coming up in a number of things. In agriculture, you may get the perfect seed developed for farmers to use so they can feed everyone, but if you don't have the economic incentives in place for the farmer to grow a surplus, he or she will not, and you won't have more food. So that systems approach is just to make sure you understand why you're not getting the outcome you want. It may be climatic, but it may not. It may be a basic development problem, and solving the climate problem may not get you the development outcome you want. And if you don't solve the development problem, no matter how much you spend on the climate problem, and at aid, our money is stovepiped, and we have to use the climate money to address climate risks. We may spend a lot of money on that. But if we're not also, if someone, not us, but someone, not us necessarily, the government, whomever, isn't taking care of the rest, you're not going to get traction, and you're not going to get the outcome you want.
I would just add from our perspective at the Wilson Center, it's very interesting for me to hear John talk about these examples from Madagascar, from Iloilo in the Philippines, from the Caribbean, because our work from USAID is looking at how we bring another stressor to this question is looking at population dynamics, and the USAID supporting work in exactly those locations that's looking at the connection between population dynamics and climate change impact. So another dimension there that helps think about this question from Cape Town. So I think, yes, please.
Emily Seiler with the U.S. Global Change Research Program. So as you know, with the new Executive Order 13653, all of the federal agencies are grappling with how to better support regional development and redesign if there is a disaster or if there's climate change in the long term. How are you working with other agencies domestically to share the knowledge that you've gained over the time during this project? And is that part of the Climate Links effort moving forward?
Okay. I bugged out to the State Department starting in January for 4 months, so I have not been intimately involved in that. But there is an interagency working group that's co-chaired by AID and Treasury. and it's aimed at working on sharing approaches and knowledge across the agencies, coming up with common ways of, as Peter mentioned earlier, I think he mentioned earlier, screening, coming up with a screening tool so that we can get a quick understanding of which projects are vulnerable and which may not be. And the idea is to sort of even out the effort across the agencies so that eventually our whole international investment portfolio will be hopefully more climate resilient. And I think there may be a session on that in a few days, and I don't know the answer about the web page, but Amy could probably answer later. Okay.
Thank you.
So Eric Boyle with ICF, and maybe this is a question for the afternoon's panels, but maybe you could talk broadly about, now that the framework has been applied to several different countries, what have you learned about ways that needs to be tailored and adapted to different country contexts? And especially design intent versus implementation, what are some of the lessons that you learned along the way as well?
Okay. We haven't gotten as far on implementing as I think any of us would like. I think one of the important things is to understand the decision processes and the policy-making processes where you're working, and tailor what you're doing to fit with that so that you're not asking another community or organization or country to adopt your approach, but rather you're molding yourself to fit with what they're doing. Jamaica, we had a fairly blank slate, but we did have to figure out how to work with the legacy policy and other policies. And then the whole country was grappling with, what do you do with this new ministry? So part of what we wanted to do was help the new ministry establish its authority in this domain, because I think it was 3 months old when we first went in. The workshop was in July. We first went in April and started talking to the government and the AID mission. So I think at the early stages, you just want to understand what's going to work for kind of the client, the beneficiary of what you're doing. And if you can fit into their processes, then there's the opportunity that domestic processes can carry forward the recommended interventions, and those domestic processes can leverage international development donor assistance to help fund the interventions. But we want to trying to leave it in the hands of the host and not us come in. The goal, both in Jamaica and a lot of these places where we're doing this, is there's a recognition that AID's funding, GIZ, German development's funding, DFID's funding, the bank's funding, none of those individually is sufficient to do everything that needs to be done. And it ought to be done respecting the sovereignty of the country where we're working. So we want to develop this process or these processes for these countries so that there is ownership and room for all the host country organizations, and the multiple international actors are going to be playing there. And at that workshop in Jamaica, we had the World Bank, the IDB, the EU, and I can't remember who else, but they all participated in parts of it. We're collaborating, particularly with the IDB, we're doing training, supporting training and capacity building at the Met Service so that they can better use equipment that I think the IDB is buying, either the IDB or the World Bank. And then a few weeks ago, I was at the launch of Grenada's National Adaptation Planning process with GIZ. GIZ led a stakeholder workshop, but we were there to bring lessons from Jamaica and make sure that as the Grenada plan moves to the point of being ready for action, AID can identify where we can work and find our niche vis-a-vis the German strength. And they'll be bringing in, well, they've already started talking to DFID. We want to bring in the IDB and the World Bank as well.
Okay, thanks. Yes, Theo?
Alan Basiste. I'm affiliated with Eyes on Earth and Renaissance Reinsurance. And my question to you is, you've talked about training trainers. Trainers need to reach the people, let's say in agriculture, the farmers. The farmers, they usually are going to be reaching out towards kind of the champions of strategy building and capacity building and implementing kind of progressive new ideas. And how is it from the bottom up where you find the champions, the farmers that are trying to implement some of these ideas, and then educating the trainers who bring it back up as some of the issues, some of the challenges, some of the accomplishments, and trying to make sure that there's dialogue from the bottom up as well as from the top down?
I think that maybe the most effective way to do that is kind of a snowballing approach. When you start working, when we started working with the Jamaican Met Service, which is several layers away from the farmer, but we already knew the director of the Met Service. We got to meet with his whole team. We asked who was going to be interested in Glenroy, and his colleague, Jackie, what's your last name?
Spence.
Jackie Spence, were more excited than anyone else. And they've been great partners. We found somebody in the Rural and Agricultural Development Authority, the Ag Extension Service of the Ag Ministry, that was more excited than everyone else. So you just have to start looking for people who are going to want to work with you, and you can kind of identify them. In some meetings, we'd have people who sort of snoozed through the discussion, and others who were up on the edge of their seats talking to us, and then rely on them to find the next layer. AID has the AID office in Jamaica has a great program through ACDI VOCA that has been working with farmers in Jamaica for a long time, and they can tell you, these farmers in these communities are more active. These farmers are less so, we're not sure why. One of my colleagues in the AID mission is a Jamaican, and he has a friend who's a coffee farmer who has been saying, every time you go out to visit a coffee farm, you stop about 5 miles before you get to mine. I want to meet these people. Bring them out. I've got questions. So you can kind of, it's a little bit of detective work, but you have to let things roll and ask people, who's more active, who's less active, who's more enthusiastic. And I'm sure that the rest of the team could do a far better job of answering that, probably all of the questions, but that one as well.
Thank you. Yes.
Thanks, John. Jim Beiser from the University of Arizona. Can you talk a little bit about how you ensure that the products and methods and approaches that are continuously coming out of the research community get into your programs? And perhaps a little bit about how you meet the challenge that researchers tend to be motivated by publishing papers more than by applying their work.
That we had the very real benefit of having Ed Carr, who is a professor at South Carolina, sit in our office for a year. And so we had a lot of talks. I'm not sure quite how much we learned from him, but we did talk a lot about how do you motivate. He wrote a 90-page paper about how to engage the academic community, and we didn't read it. No, we were trying to figure out, given this, AID staff don't have the time to read a long academic paper. Academics are not rewarded for putting together a PowerPoint. So there is this gap. And this goes back to I worked at EPA on the first national assessment, where we were trying to do these multidisciplinary studies, and we had trouble getting junior faculty to engage because they couldn't publish in their home discipline journals, and they weren't rewarded for publishing outside of their discipline. So this has been a problem for a long time. I think Ed has managed, and I think that your group at Arizona and your colleagues at Columbia are finding that you can do stuff for us and also do the research to support your own papers. And I think we just have to accept that there's going to be a dual track, and the benefit to us from that is that when Ed writes about work that he did for us in a journal that our field staff may not read, it gets into the literature, and then the IPCC finds it the next time things come around. And so then where the IPCC doesn't want to look at guidance documents or country studies and stuff that we're producing that are very useful to our staff, they hear about it from the academic community. So we need to accept this sort of dual purpose work. And on the first question about how do we bring it into our work, we try and often fail to read. We depend on our implementing partners to be sort of our eyes and ears. We work directly with academics. So we've got on the CCRD team, we've got South Carolina, we've got Arizona and Columbia University, and we've got University of Texas. So we do have as part of our team the academic community who can help us bring their latest thinking into what we're doing, and we can kind of go back and forth about what would work in the field, or have you guys go to the field for us and figure it out without us.
I thought you were going to say you have them come to the Wilson Center and then you come here to hear what they have to say.
And there's also that. Yeah.
Yes, please.
Hassan Virji from START. I want to follow up on a little bit on Jim's question, but also ask John to talk about evaluation and learning rather than evaluation and assessing, because you mentioned it, but you never really spoke about it carefully enough. It seems to me that in adaptation practice, where we are trying to change the socioeconomic cultures and attitude and perceptions to behave in a different way, assessment takes quite a bit of time, and learning from it is even more important. Take Iloilo, for example, where now they're building that major road for ASEAN Ministerial Conference and destroying all the wetlands. One of the recommendations was indeed to plant mangroves. And yet the species of mangroves that is being planted is the wrong species for that island, and yet it is supported through development assistance. And so how do we really instill a culture of continuously learning, and what are the challenges related to that you would suggest you incorporate in the practice that you're promoting?
Wow. What did I ever do to you? I don't know. I mean, this is something that we struggle with. We're under pressure to deliver results quickly. We're under pressure to deliver and move on, but also we want to learn and do the best work we can. I hope that in the circumstance like you've named in Iloilo, with what we're doing, what we're trying to do with really not us leading project design, but facilitating project design by the host community, that if we had been involved there, we would have asked and somebody would have said, that species of mangrove isn't right for here. We need a different one. And so we're trying to move away from outsiders making the decisions to our empowering people who know the local circumstances to make the decisions. As far as the learning goes, I think that we need to continue watching critically what we're doing, so that if we make mistakes like that, or we do things that work well, we can address the mistakes and replicate the successes and understand them not as the only way to do things, but what is it about what we did that made it successful. I think that the webpage, the climate links, is going to help us better bring, at least within AID and our partner network, bring us better together. The push from the push from both the executive order on resilience that's trying to bring the multiple U.S. agencies that invest overseas together is going to help with that learning, and the working group that I mentioned is sharing lessons across. And through that process, we're bringing in people from the World Bank, GIZ, DFID, and others to tell us how they dealt with these problems, so that I think that will lead, if we come up with a more common set of approaches, then the countries, when we go in and say, this is what we want to do, they can say, they'll see what we're doing and it'll make sense because it's similar to the way another agency operates, and they may be able to see some of the problems you cited. And then we're actively pursuing collaboration, particularly in the NAP space. The reason I've gone over to state is to work on a new national adaptation planning partnership that's particularly aimed at getting the bilateral donor community more engaged in national adaptation planning. It had been sort of ceded to the multilaterals, but bilaterals invest significantly in things that look like or could be supportive of national adaptation planning and the implementation that will follow. We want to bring them online and learn from each other. And one of the core functions of that NAP network is facilitating learning among countries in the NAP process and among the donor community, so that we don't all have to start from scratch every time we go somewhere new. I hope that gets at some of what you were asking.
Yes.
I have another question from online.
Yes.
Yet another PhD student from Cape Town, Irene Kunamwane. I apologize for the pronunciation. Her question is, how can we as scientists and researchers ensure that we include local communities that are not active or motivated in our interventions? Could the presenter please shed more light on that?
Sorry, could you say that again?
Mm-hmm. How can we as scientists and researchers ensure that we include local communities that are not active or motivated in our intervention?
I've come across this a couple of times particularly with the mountain work, and we were doing that first workshop in 2009 in Peru that Glenn mentioned. And I think I had to step out to deal with something, and Glenn and I were supposed to co-present a session, and so Glenn was just sort of occupying the audience while I was out of the room. And he said, and we had about a 50-50 split between decision makers, policy makers, and researchers. And Glenn said, how many of the decision makers know somebody in the research community that when you're writing a new rule or making a decision, you can call them up for advice? Maybe one or two hands went up. And then he said, how many of you in the research community know somebody on the application side that you can call and discuss so that your research is more supportive and more relevant to what they're doing? One or two hands went up. So maybe a total of 5% of the audience actually knew one another, and the rest were not talking. So we spent some time trying to get them. It sort of became like that part in church when you are told to introduce yourself to a stranger nearby. And there were plenty of them. And then we've been pushing this idea that where we're supporting research, there needs to be a link to the decision-making community. And then in Nepal, we had a situation where the last permanent village as you go up to Imja Lake in the Everest Valley hosts, if you're going up to the lake or to Island Peak, you got to go through this village, or you almost have to go through this village. And researchers go through with their equipment, they charge their cell phones and their cameras, they get their last full meal before they go up and have to prepare everything for themselves camping. And the community that was hosting us, we had a little community meeting. They said, you guys never come back and talk to us. We want to know what you're doing. We know that we're at risk. We know we've been living here longer than you've been studying here. We know that lake used to be ice and now it's water. And it worries us. Could somebody tell us what's going on? And this guy from the government, and there was an assessment of the risk of the lake that had come out about a year earlier. And a guy from the government, and they said, we'd like that. Just even if you can't send us a hard copy, tell us where it is, and we'll go up and sit in the internet cafe and read it. And the guy from the government said, even if we gave it to you, you wouldn't understand it. And for a few minutes, I think a number of us thought there might be a fight. And it got very hostile, and then Alton said, whoa, calm down, everybody. We're going up there, why don't you come up with us? And we'll explain what we see, and you explain what you see, and we'll make this collaborative. We don't want to work without you. We're doing this in order to try to protect these communities. And Cesar in particular walked around we had about, 3 or 4 people come up from the village the next day. And we walked all around with him, and Cesar said, if this were a lake in Peru, this is how I would be looking at it. What do you see? And the community hadn't been up in about a year, and they were quite astonished at how much more melting had occurred. The lake was a lot bigger. Some things that had been ponds separated by ice from the lake had joined the lake. We saw risks that had not been in the report that they were trying to get. There was water coming out the bottom of the terminal moraine. So I think that's an extremely long kind of non-answer to your question, but I think you have to actively pursue the people that you think might benefit from the work that you're doing. Ask them what would really benefit them if you want your work to be relevant, and then try to engage them. There's a good chance that they know a lot about the community or the topic that you're working on, could help help describe what's changed since before you began working there. I think Ed could probably address this a lot better, or Jim, but getting out and working with the community and engaging the people that you're doing the work with is the best way that I can think of to bring them into your work.
Great. I think we have time for, one more question.
Hi, Ryan Bartlett at WWF. I know this is largely about climate resilient development, but obviously a critical component of that is ecosystems and ecosystem services. So my question is, to what extent is this work kind of being crosswalked or coordinated with the biodiversity programming that USAID does? And even broader than that, how do you see kind of ecosystems fitting into a lot of this resilient development work that's happening?
So I'll start with the broader part first. We have, in talking to communities, walking through that framework, when one of the problems, either when one of the resources they depend upon is the natural environment, or when one of the constraints is degraded ecosystems, that's how we bring it in. And when you're talking about Madagascar, the Caribbean, Nepal, Peru, where tourism is a big part of the economy, the tourists are largely being drawn to look at the natural environment. And we had a great discussion, again, in, I think we were in St. Lucia early on, and tourism dominates the economy of the southeastern Caribbean. And they said, we're dealing with a number of problems. The financial crisis was a non-climate problem that they were dealing with. We were there in 2010, I think. Changing, the broadening of hurricane season and the sort of vaguing out of hurricane season was making it harder for visitors to plan when they would go. But then degradation of the ecosystems that draw tourists in was a huge one. And as word gets out that that the corals are not as vibrant as they were, people will go somewhere else. And one of the participants, I think from St. Lucia, said that they view themselves as now competing not only within the Caribbean, but with Florida and even on up into Georgia. And so if the product that the tourism sector doesn't offer isn't really good, they know they're competing more broadly. He joked that they're now competing with Alaska. I think he was just joking. But as you leave the Caribbean, you get into different sets of attractions. And so if the snorkeling or the scuba diving in a place isn't good, they understand that they've got to address that. And it may be a climate problem, it may be runoff from a golf course or from the roads. And so again, the non-climate stress may be the thing that's undermining their problem. And specific to the biodiversity program, in a lot of our missions where the programming actually takes place, they will mix the funding together. And so I was in Nepal about a year ago and visited very similar projects. If you just went in and looked at the project, you'd think that they were doing the same thing, and you might assume that they were developed with the same type of money. And the question that Ryan asked is, we have earmarks for clean energy, biodiversity, we have the presidential initiative on climate change, we have other things, and we have to be careful about how we spend the money and how we report on it. But in the field, from a development perspective, you want a positive result. And so the community where you're working doesn't care what kind of money you have. And so the challenge for the field staff is figuring out how to use the right type of money to accomplish what they want while abiding by the rules that come with that money. And so in Nepal, some of the biodiversity funding was being used for some improved agricultural practices. And it was very similar to a food security funded program in a different valley and a climate adaptation program in yet another valley. And so if you have a clever, dedicated field staff person trying to sort of puzzle out how you put together a robust program with different streams of money, you can start to see things align and overlap.
Good. Thank you, John. You've been on the hot seat.
Yeah,
He's like, 2 more minutes, time to wrap up. So I think we had a really good discussion, a really good start this morning. I think one of the main takeaways for me is what we mentioned earlier, that this really has not been a checkbox process. We learned this morning in the introduction that there has been an attempt to really have a systematic approach to thinking about how you roll this out. We talked about it being demand-driven, having some flexibility, working across USAID teams, working in partnership with local partners and with other programs. Stressing tools and how useful those tools can be, looking at data and downscaling of data, talking about services, and recognizing the importance of developing a community of practice to address some of their gaps that we see emerging and adapting in our learning as we look at what's working and what's not. We came away with an important consideration about bandwidth. We're all trying to do a lot. How do we work with the USAID technical staff at headquarters? How do we work with the missions that are trying to figure this out? How do we work with our colleagues on the ground who themselves find a lot of this onerous? Are we adding to their burden? How are we facilitating that? So some very important considerations. I like very much that John sort of walked us through Madagascar, and we saw the green circles and the purple circles and the red circles and where they overlap and where they don't and where they could have. He said that they had developed this process of developing these maps without talking to each other. So, once again, the recognition of those silos and how we continue to break down those silos. A lot of John's framing was, where do we want to be in the next 50 years? How do we continue to infuse that longer term perspective? John says there's a lot of pressure to come in and deliver and move on, but at the same time, you want to have some retention with the local partners and hope that there's some continuity and sustainability to the efforts. And this is what we're doing in our overall development work. John particularly talked about working within existing planning structures and mechanisms that are already in place in the local context. And we continue to recognize the importance of that. And then a really good discussion of looking not just at climate stresses, but also non-climate stresses, and how do we incorporate that and plan for that. And sort of interesting example of working with a super ministry that we had, in Jamaica, water, land, climate change, and what does this mean for coordination across ministries, and what does it mean for donor coordination? That was, I think, a very important theme that we had. So very, very rich discussion this morning. We're going to have a short break now, then go into lunch, where once again we'll have an interactive session, and this afternoon a really good opportunity to get more into detail, looking at the annexes, looking at the climate change and conflict annex, the marginal population annex and gender, and the national adaptation plans and the local adaptation plans. So a really good, interesting lunch and afternoon planned for us all. So thank you again, John. That was good. You survived.
It didn't sound much better. It probably was.
No, I thought I was good. Some really good range of points here. So I just got an email from my colleague at the bank at Wrapup who wants to join the island session.
Oh, great.
So if you have you